Until now, we are rendering all the threads along with their posts in a single page. It seems like a good time to move on and create a page that will display a single thread. I would like to visit /thread/id, like /thread/5, and view the thread with a specified ID. To implement this, we're going to implement client-side routing using ViewRouter. ViewRouter is an official Vue.js plugin that maps components to routes and makes building single-page applications with Vue.js a breeze. If you are not familiar with ViewRouter, I recommend that you watch our ViewRouter for Everyone course. This course is taught by Debbie O'Brien. In the masterclass, we will get right into using ViewRouter. So, if you want to brush up the router's functionality, you will find everything in our course dedicated to that. Excellent. Here I have opened the guide for the latest version of ViewRouter that is compatible with Vue 3. At the time of this recording, ViewRouter 4 is very new and the guide is available under next.router.vuejs.org. Make sure you are not browsing the old guide that is for Vue.js 2. Great, let's install it. I will copy-paste this command in my terminal that will install ViewRouter 4 using npm. Great, let's set it up now. I will put the guide side by side. I will do this installation inside the main.js file. As you see on the top, you first need to define some components that will be our route components. We already have one page, that is our home page. So I will import that. Great. Next we need to define some routes. I will copy this part from the guide. I will also break it into multiple lines to make it easier to read. This route object is defined for the path /, which is our home page, and it requires a component to show when this path is visited. In our case, this component is page home. Next, we should create the router instance and pass the routes option. I will also copy this part from the guide as it looks a bit verbose. Let's remove the comments. So what this does is that it creates the router variable using the ViewRouter createRouter function, and inside it passes the history mode that it is initially set to that, and the routes object that we get from here, or the routes array. In order to use ViewRouter, we need to import it. So let's do that and import it from our npm package we just installed. Lastly, we need to tell our application to use the router we have created with this function. We can do that using the use method that is available under our app instance. We have called our app forum app, so here we will say forum app use router. Okay, I think this looks good. Let's check it out in the browser. We get an error here that says cannot read property createRouter of undefined. So this refers to this line where we use ViewRouter.createRouter. The reason we get this error is because ViewRouter doesn't export an object called ViewRouter. Instead, it exports a collection of functions. If we want to import it like that, we will have to say that we're going to import everything as ViewRouter from ViewRouter. Let's try that. And now our page is back. However, we are not using ViewRouter yet. In order to put ViewRouter in use, we have to use the router view component in our template. In our case, we should use it inside our root component appView, where we have created the div with the ID of container. This component will always render the active page based on the route the user is visiting. So when we are on the home page, router view will render the page home component. So I will delete this line. And I will also remove the references for page home from my script. Great. If we refresh the browser now, our application still works, but this time we are using the router view and not hard coding the page.com component here. In the browser, you can also tell that we are using the router now because we get this hashtag in the URL. If you don't want to have the hashtag, you can change the history mode in the configuration to the HTML5 option using the create web history function. I recommend that you use the HTML5 history mode so your URLs look more natural. This setting, though, might require some configuration when you deploy to a server. I will leave a link for that in the description in case you need it. If we check back in the browser, it still works even when we don't have the hashtag in the URL. Awesome! Before we call this done, I want to give you a few tips. First of all, it's a good practice to give our route a name so we can easily reference it in our code. When we are using named routes, it is easier to refactor URLs in the future without having to update our application link. We will see more about this benefit later in this course. I will name our route home. Next, here we're importing the complete ViewRouter library. It would be better to import only the functions we use and let Webpack delete the rest of the code that we don't need from our final application bundle. We can do that by importing create router and create web history from ViewRouter. Notice that ViewRouter is a minimal library, so the two functions we use are almost as big as the full plugin. However, we save 1 kilobyte, which is better than nothing. As we discussed in the previous lesson, we want to be able to visit /thread/id, like /thread/5, and view the thread with a specified ID. We are going to implement this in this video using ViewRouter, which we now have installed and configured. Let's create a page component for displaying the thread. I will name this one page thread show. It might be tempting to name it just thread, but remember you should always use multi-word names for your components to prevent conflicts with existing and future HTML elements, since all HTML elements are a single word. Additionally, we could name our component just page thread, but we know we will have more pages related to the threads later, like for example page thread edit. At this point, it's perfectly fine if you prefer to go with page thread, but I will call mine page thread show because it's free and it reduces the chances I will need to refactor that later. The look of the thread page will actually be the same as the home page, with the only difference that it will display only one thread. So I will copy the template from home and the script, and I will remove the v4 from the root element. Inside the template, Vue expects that we have a thread object. Which is this thread in our case? The one that is specified in the URL when the users browse. So, we should set up the route configuration and come back to figure out how to find this thread here in our data source. I will add another route object here for our thread. The path will be /thread. I will give it a name of thread show for the reasons I mentioned before. And the component I want to connect it to is the page thread show. Notice how WebStorm imports that for me. Great. Now let's confirm in the browser that it works. If we visit /thread, we get an error because thread is not defined in our component. This is good and it means that our route works. Now let's try to grab the ID. In ViewRouter, to create a dynamic route that will carry a parameter, we use the colon symbol. we specify the name of the param after the colon, and in our case the param is the ID of the thread we want to show. Okay, let's check back in the browser by visiting /thread/NID. Let's use Vue DevTools to inspect what's going on. Under our active component, page thread show, notice that we have a special $route property. In here, there is an option called params, which we can access from within our component. Here you can also see other useful information regarding the active route. Notice here that we have the ID and the value that is specified in the URL. If I change the URL, the param changes too. Great! So now that we have the ID from the route, we can access it in our component to find the thread. There are a lot of ways to implement that. I like to use a computed property because its value is cast and it will be reactive every time the ID changes. Inside the computed property or any other Vue instance method, we can access the params under this $route.params. In this case, the param we want to access is the ID. That should do the trick. Let's check again and use a valid ID this time in the browser. I got this one from the data.json file. Awesome! We got to see the specified thread. If we change the ID to another one, we get to see another thread. Fantastic! Before we go to the next lesson, I want to give you a small tip. Instead of using $route.params.id in our component, we can instruct Vue router to pass the value of the parameter as a component prop to our component. This is a good practice for component self-documentation, as we will define the ID prop. It is also beneficial when it comes to testing, as the component is flexible and not tightly coupled to the router. To pass the ID as a parameter, we add props true to the route. In the page thread show component, we should define the ID prop that will be required and a string. This way, it's clear what our component needs and we don't have to read the full code to understand what parameter it uses and where we get the ID from. In our computed property, I will replace this route params ID with this ID. Back in the browser, everything works the same. As of now, we define the router configuration and our routes inside main.js. This is not wrong, but we could benefit from storing the configuration in another file that will be dedicated to routing. In Vue applications, it is common to have a directory under src called router and have the router configuration in a JavaScript file under that. I will create this router folder and an index.js file in there. Now let's see what we can move in here. I will cut the import statements of our page components, the functions from Vue router, the routes, and here that we create the new router. Great, everything seems to be fine here, but we have to export the router that we create so that we can import it in main.js and install it on our application. So here I will make this a default export. Back in main.js, we should import the router instance we just created. Because the file inside is called index.js, we can import it directly from @/router and we don't need to specify the file name if we don't want to. Awesome! This should work as it is. Let's give it a refresh and everything works fine. Now our main.js file is shorter. It's clear what it does. It creates an app, it installs router, and it mounts on the element with the ID of app. Our router file is also very straightforward. It imports the page components, it imports the functions we need from ViewRouter, and then we define the routes we need, and we're exporting a new router instance that includes the configuration and the routes. By now, we are displaying the complete threads on the home page, and we have the thread page that we have not linked anywhere yet. To give it a better shape, we can show a list of the threads in the home page and allow users to navigate to the thread they want to read. It's often beneficial to think about how you want to use a feature in your application before you start developing the components. I will open up our page home component, that is our homepage. Let's delete what we have in the template as we don't need it anymore. It would be nice to have a heading and use a component to display a list of threads instead of doing the v-for directly in the page home component. Something like a component called thread list would be nice for now. Let's create this thread list component under our components directory. In order to fill in the template, I will consult our mockup to copy the designed HTML. If you don't have a mockup for your project or the design is not important, you can just go ahead and create the divs and the other elements to create the feature you need. In our mockup directory, the page that contains a list of threads is the forum page. If you want to get familiar with the mockups we have provided you, feel free to open the several static files in your browser. This way, you will also get some spoilers of what's about to come. I will move on and open forum HTML in the browser. This element here with the title of threads is the list of threads I'm looking for. So I will copy this HTML code. Now I will paste the code inside our thread list component template. I will collapse the divs with the class of thread to get a better understanding of our markup. Outside the div with the class of thread list, we have a pagination element. It will take a while until we get to that, so I will remove it for now. So now we have a clean template for our list of threads. Each div with a class of thread represents a thread. Thus, I will delete all of them except of one that I will apply a v-for directive to create multiple elements dynamically based on the threads we have in our data. Sweet! Now let's see what we want to show within each thread. Here we want to show the thread title. I will again use the hashtag for the link, and I will show you how to implement the links later. In this element, we display the name of the user that created the thread. I will copy the script from page home to implement that quickly. Our helper method is called user_by_id. Using our helper, we can find the user with the ID that is the same with thread user ID, and then grab its name. Here, instead of yesterday, we can have the thread published at property. The last element is about the recent activity. We don't know how to get these values besides of the replies count, so we can either delete the element or use the details of the thread temporarily. I prefer to use the thread details so our app looks more fun. Initially, I will get the replies count by using the length of the post property of our thread. For the avatar URL, I will use our helper, user_by_id, and then grab the avatar property of the user. I will also use the name of the creator for the recent activity. And the publish stat property. That should be good. Let's check our work in the browser. It doesn't work. That's probably because we have not imported our component inside page home. Let's fix that. We should also define our component inside the components option. Let's check again. Great, we get the list, but we also get this strange value. Let's check that quickly. Right, so here, instead of showing the complete user object, we want to display just the user name. Fantastic! Here you can see the thread titles, the information of the user that created the thread, the count of the replies, and some information of when the thread and by whom was created. I notice here that I missed the word replies, so I will add that quickly. Perfect. Let's review what we have made. In the page home component, we are importing the thread list that renders all the threads. In the thread list, we create a div for each thread in our threads data. Our thread list component is now tightly coupled to our data.json file. No matter where we want to use this component, it will display all the threads that we have. This is not a good behavior for a component. We want our component to be reusable, so we are able to command it which threads to display. Then, in any place of our website we want to display a list of threads, we can import it and reuse it. To make that happen, we should make the component accept the threads as a prop instead of importing all the threads inside our component directly. Our threads prop should be type of array and always provided, so I will mark it as required. Now we should delete the threads data. We still need the posts and the users because we are searching into these arrays to find the related objects as we don't have an API to fetch data from yet. Now in the home page, we should delete what we don't need. If we try to render our list like that, we will get an error in the browser console because we have not passed the threads prop to our component that is required. The error that we get here signals that we did a good job defining our prop, so we know exactly why we don't see any threads. Perfect, let's pass the threads as a prop. Back in the browser, now we get the list with all available threads. Awesome. You might want to break your thread list component down to use a thread list item component that will include the logic for the single threads. That way, essentially the thread list responsibility would be just to create multiple instances of the thread list item component. If you have quite some logic for each item and you think that would be beneficial for your project, this is a good practice to apply. In our case, the logic is pretty minimal yet, so I don't think that we need to break down the component for now. Thus, I will keep all the logic here. Feel free to create the thread list item component by yourself if you want to. We now have the list of threads in the home page, and we have a route that displays a single thread. In this lesson, we will link the list items with a thread page, so when a user clicks on a thread, they are redirected to read it. The path for the thread page is /thread/id. I will open the thread list component, that is the one we use in the home page to create the list. Here we already have a link element, so let's go on and make it functional. The first idea that comes in mind is to dynamically set the href attribute of the A tag to the route path. In this case, that would be /thread/the thread ID. Let's give it a shot in the browser. When we click the link, we are being redirected to the threads page, which is nice. But notice that the browser tries to reload the page. That should not happen in a single page application. To prevent the browser from reloading the page, we can use the router link component. The router link component is available in all router-aware components. Since we have injected the router in the root view instance in main.js, all our components are aware of the router. In order to render a link using the router link component, we have to pass it a to property. To can be a string with a path or an object. If I replace the a tag with router link and switch href with to, there won't be any difference in the rendered markup since router link renders an a-core tag by default. The router link component allows the navigation to take place on the client side, and we won't see the browser reloading. This way, navigation becomes much faster. We can improve our code by using the object syntax for the to property. Instead of passing the dynamic path directly as a string, we can also use an object with the name of the route and the required parameter. The required param we want to pass here is the ID param, and the value is the ID of the related thread. I will open our routes file to find the name we gave to our route. It is called thread_show. So our router link tag will be this: to name thread_show params ID thread ID. The output in the browser is the same, but we get two benefits by using the object syntax. Firstly, we get a small benefit that the link is easier to read and understand what data are being passed to the routes and their purpose. Here we know, for instance, that the route requires the ID param. Secondly, and most importantly, when we are using a named route instead of the path, we can change the route's path in router index.js without having to update and refactor our application. Let me show you. I will change the thread show's path to /thread/show/id. If I switch back to the browser, without making any change in our code, notice that our links still work perfectly fine. Imagine how huge is that if you have hundreds of links in your code base that you would have to refactor. I want to note here that changing the paths can negatively affect your SEO if your application is public. Also, it can confuse your users and break links they have shared or stored. So have that in mind and try to keep your route paths as stable as possible. Let's switch back the route path to /thread. By now we have defined two paths, the home page and the threads. If we try to browse a page that doesn't exist, like /posts, we will get an empty page without any information on what's going on. What we want to happen here in a real-world application is to display an error. See, for example, what you get on ViewSchool.io when you try to browse a page that doesn't exist. This is a nice feature that we should implement in our forum. Let's see how we can do that. To be honest, I always forget the syntax for doing that in ViewRouter, so I will open the router guide and see what we get there. Here they have a route that will match anything. Anything like all the paths of our application. I will copy this route and play with it in our app. I will create a page component to have something to test with. I will call it page_not_found to comply with the naming convention we are using in our application. In the template, I will just add a heading saying not found. Let's go back to our route file and import the component to use it. Great, let's give it a shot in the browser. It works already, and /posts now says not found. Awesome. It's also important to test that our home page and the thread page still work. And they do. Know that our other registered routes get prioritized over the path match, so it doesn't matter if you put the not found route last or first in your array. I like to have it last. Okay, I will update the template of our not found page quickly and explain a common caveat you might neglect when you are implementing not found functionality on the client side. I will wrap the template in a div with a class of callFull that we use in the rest of the pages. I will also add a link using router link for users to navigate away of the not found page. Let's give it a preview. /posts. Not found. Read some cool threads. Awesome. I want to have the text of the center, so I will use our text center helper. Excellent. Now it's time to explain the caveat. Our implementation of the not found functionality is called Soft 404. This is because even though we mention the error and we show the not found page, our application returns a response code of 200 OK. Let me show you this quickly. I will switch to the View School.io not found page and open the network tab before hitting refresh. Notice that the page in the network is red and comes with an error code of 404 not found. If I open the network and refresh our forum not found, you will notice that the page is white and the status code is 304 OK. When our users visit a page that doesn't exist, what we have here is perfect. But when bots and crawlers visit our website and pages, we could confuse them and sometimes miss out because many bots read the response code and not the content we have on the page. Luckily, Google and Yahoo have reported that they use automated processes to read the content too, so they should be able to understand soft 404s like this one too. However, we cannot return a 404 code from our router because our routing takes place on the client side, after the server has already responded with 200 OK or 304. If you want to return a 404 code, you should configure your server to do that. We will look into that later in the course when we have deployed our application to an online server. For now, we are good with the soft 404. Our not found page will catch all URLs the users visit that we have not defined. But if users try to visit the thread page with an invalid thread ID, then they are stuck with an empty page, and we also get an error in the console. The error says that cannot read property title of undefined. If you want to fix this, you have a lot of options. In this lesson, I will show you a few solutions, including a neat trick that is available only in the newest Vue Router 4 version. The simplest option is to handle what we display in the page components template. Inside page thread show in the template, we assume that we have a thread. So when we are not able to find one, our code fails. To fix this here, we can wrap our root div element in a v-if and only proceed when we have a thread. This way, if we don't have a thread, we will not get an error in the console and we will still display an empty page to the user. If we want to show them a custom error page, we can do it right here. We can have another div right after the div that displays a thread that we display when we don't have a thread, thus using velse. I will copy the markup for this div from our page not found component. Great. And instead of not found, here we can say this thread does not exist, or this thread is not found. We can keep the link for reading some cool threads. I think this is a good one. Let's confirm that this works in the browser. I will refresh this page, and now we get this custom error, this thread does not exist, and we have the link to go to the homepage. Let's try to visit the thread that we do have, like this one, and it still works. So our solution is good. This approach allows you to customize what you show when a thread does not exist. The downside of this solution is that you might need to repeat this logic for every page you have that relies on a resource, like a thread, a blog post, a category, a user, and so on. But it's fine if you think that it suits your use case. If you want to reuse your page not found component, you still have many options to do that. One solution is to redirect directly to our not found page when the thread does not exist. I'm going to show you how to do it using navigation guards. We will cover navigation guards in detail later in the course. For now, I want to focus on how we can use a route guard to implement this specific feature. Before I do that, I will revert the changes we did in this component. Let's open our router file. Navigation guards allow us to cancel or redirect a route navigation. There are a number of ways to hook into the route navigation process. You can do this globally, per route, or in component. To redirect to the not found page, if the requested thread does not exist, I will use a per route guard called before ender. Per route guards are defined inside the route object in our router file. Navigation guards accept three arguments: the to, which is the route navigating to, the from, which is the route we are navigating away from, and the next, which is a function that we can run to resolve the navigation. The code we will place inside the before ender function will run before router allows the user to enter this route. In here, we want to check if the thread with a specified ID exists. If it exists, we want to allow the navigation to continue uninterrupted. If it doesn't exist, we want to redirect the user to the not found page. Let's implement this step by step. To check if the thread exists in our current setup, we have to look in our data.json file. So I will import our data inside router the same way we import it in our components. I like to call the local variable source data just so we don't confuse it with the component data option. With access to our data now, we can use find to define if the thread exists. To get the ID that is specified in the URL parameters, we will use to.params.id. All URL parameters of the target route are exposed inside route guards under to.params. Here you could make a call to your API if you use one, as we will do later in the course. Next, if the thread exists, we want to continue the navigation normally. We can allow the navigation to continue by calling the next function with no arguments. Great! Now, if the thread doesn't exist, to redirect to the not found page, we will call next and provide it the route to redirect to. Next accepts the same argument as the toProp router link accepts. I will use an object and provide the name of the target route that is not found. That should do. Let's check our work in the browser. First, I will open a thread that exists to ensure that it still works. And it does. Great. Now, I will visit a thread that doesn't exist. And successfully, we are redirected to the not found page. This is great. Oftentimes, though, you want to show the not found page but do not change the URL. This allows the user to fix a typo in the link or review what is the URL that does not exist. Again, there are many ways to do that. I will show you the newest solution that is available in Vue Router 4, which I consider the most simple label-wise. I will open the router guide to begin with. This is the section where we initially copied the path match for our not found page. Below it says, in this specific scenario, we are using a custom regex between parentheses and making the path match param as optionally repeatable. This allows us to directly navigate to the route if we need to, by splitting the path into an array. This part here is our golden ticket. Below in the code example, they show how to redirect to the not found route and pass along the current URL path using the path match parameter. This is exactly what we need. The object that is passed in router push is the same object we pass when we call the next function. So I will copy this object from here. I notice that it uses this $route, which is what we would use inside the view component. But this will not work inside the router guard as we don't have access to this. To access the information of the active route inside our navigation guard, we use the to parameter. This code here will break the active path into an array and will pass it as the value of the path match parameter to our not found page. I know this code might look a bit confusing, but don't worry, that's because it is a bit complicated, as it is all based on regex and the dynamic route matching. You will most likely only need to use this to implement this very feature of not changing the URL of a not found resource. Let's check it out in the browser. I will visit a thread that does not exist. And now we are not redirected to the home page, which is great. I notice though that we have two slashes in the beginning of our URL. I guess that's because the path we pass in the parameters also includes the initial slash. To remove that from the path string before we break it into an array, we can use the substring JavaScript function and remove one character. This should do the trick. Let's check it out in the browser. Awesome! We can now navigate to a non-existing resource and see our not found page without modifying the URL. So users can review the URL and try to fix it if they have made a typo, or just copy and paste it to report the error to you. If you want to make this feature top-notch, you can make it also pass along the query params and the URL hash. For example, if we visit a missing thread, where life equals good and hashtag hello, this should not be stripped out when the resource does not exist, as it happens now. To implement that, we will pass the query and the hash of the current route to the target. We can access both under the to argument. If we check in the browser now, we preserve both the query and the hash. Amazing! And don't worry, you were not supposed to know how to do that. This is a new feature and the documentation is still very new. More and more tips and tricks are being added as time passes. I have also opened the pull request and I'm working on it with Eduardo to improve this specific example. So in the future, you might be able to copy this directly from the docs.